afternoon, everyone. The program committee has put me in this precarious position where I am the speaker after lunch, so I need to project and be vivacious and loud, keep you all entertained. So my goal in my talk today is twofold. One, to give you some practical, pragmatic advice about how we can improve our collaboration with our counterparts on the risk management and cyber defense side, while also introducing you to a framework that we created several months ago. There we go. So just a few housekeeping items before we start. We're going to be presenting a lot of material in here. Please feel free to take pictures, but at the same point in time, this is TLP clear, so everything will be presented and will be available to you in PowerPoint and video recording. Everything that I'm presenting is a reflection of my personal views. It does not reflect my employer's. Hopefully, though, we will be able to provide you with a good meme to content ratio to keep this entertaining. And with that, let's go ahead and get started. So I've got two kind of main pillars that I want to talk through today, and they're going to be a lot. So there's a lot of content that we need to cover. It's going to be a scene setter when we get started to talk about a common frame of reference, something that we need to share with our stakeholders, something that we sometimes as CTI analysts forget exists, where we need to balance between our language that we use and the language that they're familiar with. I have some bad news. This talk is mostly on communication and expectations management, which is not a bad thing. But in this context, it's something that we tend to take for granted. So when we're trying to gain traction with our stakeholders in particular, we need to be able to understand their common frame of reference. So we're going to start there. The first few slides that we'll talk through will actually speak to that. So we'll do some level setting, some of which was covered by the presenters earlier. So we'll move through that at a kind of brisk pace. The next thing we'll talk about is the various types of support that we can actually provide, ranging from strategic to operational to tactical. You saw kind of the diagram, the structure set up earlier. We'll continue on that spectrum and we'll talk in more depth about it. And lastly, I'll be able to introduce you to what those kind of requisite skills and responsibilities are, the knowledge and ability base for our various different CTI components and how they actually interplay. Then at the end of the presentation, I will give you a little bit of a surprise. Okay, so who am I? I'm John Doyle. Hello. I've been in digital forensics and cyber threat intelligence for about 15 years. I'm currently with Mandiant. I spent the last 3 years with Mandiant in an intelligence enablement capacity. So I've done some incident response engagements. I've been able to go out and work with various clients to assess their CTI programs and help them build better, uplifting skills of teams while also kind of working internally as part of our DPRK and Russia Watchers community. Prior to joining Mandiant, I spent roughly a decade in the CIA. So I was one of the premier analysts that we had there. So I was one of the few senior analysts. When I started my journey in the CIA, kind of getting into CTI, my focus was on transnational issues. So like the CISSP, I was roughly an inch deep and a mile wide, covering all the intrusion sets, looking for deltas, trying to figure out and help forecast. Towards the end of my career at the CIA, I got really smart on Russia and China, which is something I've taken with me to Mandiant. I also teach the Forensics 578 course. So I'm one of the few instructors at SANS who does that, and you can kind of see the rest of my background there. Chances are we won't have time for questions. So while we go through a bulk of the material, please feel free to catch me at the break. The way I'd like to start this discussion off is with the OODA loop. Now, this is maybe a familiar concept to some of you and maybe a new concept to others. For those who this is the first time seeing the OODA loop, I'd like to present it a little bit differently. Quick background on the OODA loop. Developed in 1974 by an Air Forceman. The OODA loop helps us make strategic decisions. It is broken out into 4 different phases, of which it acts as a feedback loop, each phase feeding into the next. In the context of cyber security, cyber threat intelligence, cyber operations, we need to understand that on the defensive side, we have an OODA loop in play, and so does the offense. Working as a CTI component, we enable our network defenders to be able to move faster around that OODA loop And the faster we move around the OODA loop, we start to outpace the red team. We start to outpace the adversaries. And that is the value add of CTI using kind of the OODA loop model. So arguably, we find ourselves in 3 phases here. Orient, observe, and decide. Now, we have a bigger play in observe. However, in the other 2 phases, we're advisors. So if we think about this from a RACI matrix, if you have the clout, if you have the rapport with the respective teams, incident responders, SOC analysts, you have the ability to influence decisions, to make us work more effectively. Okay, sorry, having some difficulties here with the slides. So one of the frameworks that exists that's actually quite nice out there is the NIST framework. It breaks down requisite roles, knowledge, skills, and ability responsibilities across various tasks. One of the areas that I think it has some shortcomings with is cyber threat intelligence. And for that reason, I wanted to spend a lot of time talking about what specific roles and responsibilities we have, how we can work together. And this is where I bridge the generational gap in the room. What would you say you do here? Well, that's kind of the question that we usually get as CTI analysts. So we provide timely, actionable, relevant information to help inform risk reduction, risk exposure, and cyber defense actions. That is about as pithy as I can get it. As you saw earlier, there's 3 different types of audiences that we tend to focus on: strategic, operational, and tactical. Each of those has a different set of requirements. Each of those has a different vernacular they respond to. Each of those has a different culture. And depending on your background and your experience, you may fall into one of these naturally. You may have to grow into it. Typically, you find analysts kind of range the spectrum. I have more of an operational background, but recently I've had to do a lot more strategic stuff. That happens. Part of what we're going to talk to is not just how you can communicate more effectively with the various stakeholders, but also what those products look like. So it's going to take one of 3 forms. First, understanding the culture, the nomenclature, the language. Second, how to talk better in a more meaningful way to get your message to resonate. And third is going to be how you do this in written production. So what are some of the product types and what do they look like that will enable us to be more effective in getting that message across? So clearly there must just be one standard job role out there. No, that's obviously not the case. I would not have put this up here if it was. What you find is job descriptions tend to vary widely, even across those that are being used. So something like a cybercrime analyst, something as a technical analyst, it truly ranges the spectrum. And based on business needs, organizational needs, you'll find that there's different levels of depth that are expected, different experience prerequisites. Part of what I want to do is actually break down how we think about this. So what you'll see at the end a little bit is some of the traditional roles defined a bit better in a more meaningful way that maps to that strategic, operational, and tactical level of support. So at the workshop yesterday, we had a really good question come up, and it actually inspired me to make this slide. It was, okay, how do we think about our stakeholders? And really, you can break them down into 3 different camps. You have one where you are working at a private sector company, something internal. Now, you might have different stakeholders on here. This is just representative. Things like fraud might be up there. Things like product might be up there. But by and large, this is the type of thing you'll see. If you're working in a CERT, you might have a more national level objective. So in addition to supporting your internal stakeholders, you're supporting various industry segments too, putting out advisories and trying to work with various companies. And then the last one is kind of military and intelligence services. They have a whole host of different internal and external stakeholders to consider. So I put this together just as kind of a frame of reference or a methodology that you might employ yourselves. One of the things that I think often is overlooked is everyone views an individual analyst as a monolith. You are a representative of the team, when in reality, teams are designed in order to be resilient and have a robust representation. So when we're thinking about kind of team construct here, the team should be formed around the skills needed to service the intelligence requirements for our stakeholders. There's a lot of different setups here. One of the ones that I'm going to talk to you a little bit about is kind of how that maps to this framework I created back in May that we published. Since we covered the intelligence lifecycle, I could just skip that for the purpose of time. Instead, we can focus on this right-hand part of the slide. When we're thinking about mapping intelligence requirements, there's a few different ways we can do it. This is the one that I typically use with my clients. Lay out the intelligence requirements, identify the status, define the priority. That's all you. That's all you communicating with them, talking and trying to understand what they need. Where it gets more interesting is when you actually start to do alignment. And I'm sure when we have the conversation later about metrics and developing KPIs, this will come up. How do you align it with the products that you're producing in a way where you can actually measure against it? I'm going to spend the next few slides kind of analyzing a few of these different roles. What is required and what does it look like to support these various different stakeholders? So let's start at strategic and work our way down to tactical. On the strategic side, typically our consumers are C-suite executives, risk managers, leadership. They're looking for things like trend analysis. They want to know, how can I limit risk exposure? What do I need to worry about? How can I invest my finite resources? You are in a very powerful position if you're producing strategic analysis because you can have that type of impact on an organization. However, that requires having a good understanding of several different dynamics, some of which were covered earlier. Understanding how to forecast, taking a systems engineering approach, knowing what all the different inputs are, how everything kind of interrelates, from cyber defense to technology trends, to attack surface, to understanding threat. There are some others that you see on the screen here too. Understanding how the landscape is going to change and when to raise that type of information, whether it's via geopolitical drivers or whether it's something that the organization has decided to do internally. If we harken back to the definition of threat, it takes 3 different inputs. So think of it as a function. Those 3 parts are opportunity, capability, and intent. We on the blue team side only have the ability to cover opportunity, which is reducing the attack surface. The rest are dictated by the attacker. Strategic analysts should be able to really quickly pinpoint and identify various motivations that actors have. What my colleagues and I did was put together kind of a, not completely fulsome, but fairly representative model of what those motivations actually look like, ranging from espionage to attack, and the reasoning why various actor groups might decide to take the course of action in which they do. One of the things I find we sometimes take for granted, but coming from the intelligence space is very important to me, is thinking about how different nation state and criminal programs are actually orchestrated. Much like you and I have roles and responsibilities on the blue side, they also have roles and responsibilities. Understanding those constituent parts enables us to be able to make informed decisions, to make analytic assessments. What you see on the left-hand side is the supporting elements in kind of a nation-state cyber program. What you see on the right-hand side is what people typically think about just based on the way the media kind of portrays it. Your hands-on keyboard operator, your hacker, the one too in the operations. I have a whole rant I can go on with you over beers or at a break where I'm talking about this stuff. So let me just go ahead and skip forward. I would not be one of my presentations if you did not see a Taylor Swift meme. So here we go. How do you communicate all of this information in a meaningful way to your stakeholders is where we're going now. Well, there's a few things. We covered threat landscapes earlier. We covered under the guise of threat modeling. So creating an organizational threat profile is something that we recommend every client does to start the prioritization, to start the orientation. Threat modeling is just a different term. It acts as an input for it. Various other types of reports can be created. I just took some snippets here. Trending reports, identifying the state of how the state of things change when you encounter something unexpected like a fully remote workforce, thanks to the pandemic, or an uptick in ransomware, or various groups exploiting CVEs that just came out. As we move on and start looking at the operational support, really what we're looking at here is being able to provide our incident responders, our purple teams, in some cases our red teams, with actionable information, actionable insights to help them hunt, to help them be able to reduce the dwell time of adversaries on a network. This takes a different type of mindset than what you saw with the strategic analyst. The strategic analyst tends not to have as much depth, but they have breadth. So they can really quickly feed their OODA loop, understand how that changes the environment. Whereas in this case here, with the operational analysts, they're more technical, usually. They tend to understand at a more deep level how adversary actions take place, what artifacts are left, in an effort to be able to properly support these various groups. So let's take a look at some of the things they should be responsible for. At a high level, they should be able to explain and convey workflows. How does an adversary operation actually work? Now, I've borrowed from military parlance here using red team, blue team, red space, blue space, and gray space. But if you lay this down and you can explain to your various stakeholders, oh, we're seeing trends in the hosting providers and the VPSs used. We're seeing trends in the type of infrastructure that's used as cutouts. Being able to understand, well, no, adversaries don't maintain 100 points of presence on a victim network. They usually only maintain 3 or 4. Those are the type of things that will start to actually win clout with the various stakeholders here. So in the example of the strategic analyst, if you're trying to write for a risk management function, kind of behooves you to understand their nomenclature, their terminology, things like the risk register, things like risk exposure, so that they can quickly input it into their own process, their own workflow. The same is true for operational analysts too. Understanding concepts like the spreadsheet of doom, understanding host commands, network-based indicators, HBIs, NBIs. All of these terms that are batted around by incident responders that sometimes CTI analysts who don't have the exposure or background won't understand. Conceptually, they'll get it. It just takes a little explanation. So there are unspoken expectations on both sides for what we expect of our stakeholders to know and what they expect of us. Here's some products that you might be able to use in kind of an effective way. This is a hunt package I created for APT28 a few years back. I didn't give you the whole thing, but I gave you some snippets. Summary up front, who the actor is, so a little strategic. Then working through a workflow. What type of tools do they use at the various parts of an attack lifecycle? Really helps orient the responders, really gives them kind of a good lay of the land, situational awareness up front, followed by areas that they should look if they encounter artifacts that resemble APT28. I cannot stress the utility of using workflow diagrams. It is very easy to show exploitation chains. It is very easy to show exploitation chains. And it resonates. Now, that was discussed earlier, so let me not belabor that point any further than I have to. If we look at one more operational customer, we're looking at kind of vuln management, patch management. And it's a different set of skills, much like you saw with incident response analysts, kind of on that same operational pain. Understanding what the exact workflow of the patch management team looks like is something that we typically don't have transparency to, not on the CTI side. So having a bit of humility and asking, hey, can I sit with you for a day? Can you walk me through what scanners you use, how you're prioritizing your patches, how you're going about making your decisions, what your normal daily workflow looks like is something that ends up being very useful in allowing us to then integrate it into our own loops. So when we're producing reports, when we're producing any sort of suggestions and recommendations, we can use our understanding of their processes to our advantage, and that'll make it click a lot easier. In the interest of time, I'll just kind of move on because I want to show you this really cool humble brag framework that I created. Everyone in here is familiar with MITRE ATT&CK. And since that's a common frame of reference, let me go in and explain this in that context. Back in May, we've released this framework, CTI Analyst Core Competencies Framework. By design, it was supposed to serve three purposes: help educate, help create pathways and roadmaps, and also help our partners on the various blue elements be able to work better with us, having an understanding of what we actually do and what those skills are. The way I've broken this out is into 4 different pillars. Each of the pillars is defined by the top here, so you have problem solving, personal effectiveness, technical literacy, and cyber threat proficiency. In each of those pillars, there's 3 different competencies for each. I'm not going to spend much time going through it. You can read the report, you can read the slides. What I will do is talk about why we chose those, because I think that's the important message to deliver here. The pillars you see on the left represent what we typically consider soft skills, but it's kind of not. It's more than that. It helps us be able to communicate. It helps us be able to break through barriers and challenges that we see. It helps us follow the breadcrumbs, if you will. The right-hand side tends to be things that are more learned. So you can take a SANS class, you can take a technical training and learn some of these more hard skills. What we've done, though, as part of this framework is actually enumerate them. So much like ATT&CK has enumerated TTPs, what we've tried to do here is enumerate various knowledge, skills, abilities, and traits. That's way too hard to read, so we're not going to focus on that. It's just here so you understand what goes into it. I'm going to move through this really quickly because I don't want to spend too much time. When we focus on each of these, there's kind of a constituent, I would say, grouping and some key takeaways that I want you to walk away with. Critical thinking is absolutely imperative, right, to be successful in this particular role, irrespective of whether you're going to be doing strategic, operational, or tactical level analysis. You need to be able to think critically, understand and examine data sets, be able to do critical evaluation. Is this representative? Is it not? If it's not, where can I go next? What's the next step? How do I build that intuition? Same thing with research and analysis. What are the various data points out there that I need? What exists? What can I get? How can I use it? How is this going to better me? How can I pull this all together into something meaningful? And we covered the Intel lifecycle and the process of creating and exploiting data already, so I'm not going to cover that. And then passion. Investigative mindset is intuition. And we're all kind of a self-chosen breed in this field where we're all intellectually curious and we're all pretty smart. So this investigative mindset comes almost naturally to most of us. When we think about professional effectiveness, obviously communication is a big thing, whether that's in written form, whether that's interpersonal relationships, whether that's being able to present effectively during a briefing to various different stakeholders. The thing that's often forgotten, and I want to foot stomp that here, is this last competency. Business acumen. Understanding what the mission, vision, and goals are for the organization so that when we actually craft our product, when we provide our responses, we're doing it in a way where it's going to resonate with our stakeholders, leadership, et cetera. Also, one of the things that I think tends to go underrepresented is an understanding of the specific technologies in place. So if you're working for a financial company, a bank, there are payment systems. That is not typical IT. So having a deeper understanding of how those interplay, understanding the risk surface there, the threat surface, will allow us to be able to more meaningfully provide accurate and precise analytic assessments. In the interest of time, I'll just move through these next two. Technical literacy is exactly what you'd expect it to be. understanding IT networks, understanding security apparatus, understanding the various teams. This field has grown, cybersecurity has grown immensely to all of these specialized disciplines. Cyber Threat Proficiency tends to be the one that we're strongest on, the one that we need to know the most of. So let me start to conclude this particular part of the presentation with just some thoughts. You will find analysts who are good and can flex across all of the different 3 dimensions: strategic, operational, and tactical. Typically, that's not the case. And typically, those don't really exist because they're getting pulled in a lot of different directions. So, instead, relying on our team, relying on the skills of others, understanding who has good relationships and how we can go about employing those to better understand our stakeholders ends up being imperative. Some of the things I recommend, and one of the kind of cool cases I saw with one of my clients is they actually had a liaison on all of their stakeholder teams who championed and advocated for them. There was monthly, quarterly interactions with them, and it was symbiotic. Designating somebody on your team to be a representative for each of those stakeholders ends up adding some continuity, and then you kind of all grow together. Asking them, what does a day in your life look like? So having brown bag sessions, maybe buddying up next to them so that you can better understand what their actual requirements are, also kind of a helpful trait. Third, stop using intel language. They understand their own lexicon. They understand what a use case is. They understand what a workflow is. If you say, what's your intelligence requirement? If they've never been an intelligence practitioner before, they're just going to look at you like a deer in headlights. So we have to adapt. And that's part of the process. My colleague Jake mentioned earlier, establishing realistic SLAs between groups ends up being quite useful, because then you have some process in place to set expectations, to be able to manage expectations. So I provided you some resources here to the framework itself, as well as to kind of a blog that I created looking at different type of questions. One of the things that I did want to call out specifically, though, is I just released this before the presentation started. So there is a core competencies mapping to those 3 different job roles that we talked about: strategic, threat, and vulnerability analyst, as well as kind of a breakdown in an Excel spreadsheet of what those look like. So if you want to take this, if you're a recruiter, if you're a hiring advisor, please feel free to use this. I created what I think is a scorecard, something that would be useful for the community. If you do use it, please give me feedback. We are constantly refining. And the way I'll conclude here is we can make fetch happen, so don't be a Regina George. We can work together. We can work more effectively across various teams. We can improve the OODA loop. And I am John Doyle at Twitter. Thank you so much for having me.